After Michael Madsen was found dead in his Malibu home on July 3, 2025, the property was hastily cordoned off and remained under investigation for weeks. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, though some close friends disputed it, claiming he had been trying to turn his life around. By late July, the house, a weathered Spanish colonial perched on Birdview Avenue, staring directly over the rocky Malibu coast, was still in probate. But the estate executors quietly allowed it to be rented out short-term to an Oregon couple, Daniel and Marissa Clark, while the formalities were being handled. They were aware it was Madsen's house. The headlines had been everywhere, but Daniel, a struggling screenwriter, found it inspiring. He thought maybe being in a house once owned by a gritty Hollywood actor would help him write again. The very first night, Marissa told Daniel that the house felt crowded, despite being alone. She complained of hearing voices at night, indistinct but angry-sounding, often near the back of the house where Madsen kept his private bar and office. At first, Daniel dismissed it as stress or imagination. But within days, Marissa's demeanor changed. She grew irritable, restless, and withdrawn. She began waking up at exactly 3:17 a.m., drenched in sweat, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of their bed. Daniel saw nothing, but a persistent smell of old cigar smoke lingered every night around the same hour, despite no one in the house smoking. Then came the incident in the living room. Daniel, writing late one evening, heard heavy boots walking on the hardwood floor behind him. He assumed it was Marissa, but when he turned, no one was there. The sound stopped immediately, but when he stood, he realized the floor had scuff marks, like someone had paced back and forth in heavy boots. The worst energy seemed concentrated in the converted den, where Madsen had spent much of his time in seclusion. The walls were still lined with built-in shelves that smelled of stale whiskey and cedar, and no matter how high the thermostat was set, the room remained icy cold. Marissa refused to enter that room entirely after she caught a glimpse of a tall, dark figure reflected in the den's window one night, a hulking man with a grim scowl, who vanished when she turned. Both Daniel and Marissa reported a persistent sensation of being watched, particularly from the old balcony facing the ocean. Often, they'd wake to find the balcony door ajar, despite checking it was locked before bed. Marissa, increasingly paranoid, began researching Madsen's last days in the house and discovered reports from neighbors who'd heard him talking to himself loudly, aggressively in the dead of night, just weeks before his death. Their stay came to an abrupt end 3 weeks in. On the final night, Daniel was alone in the den, attempting to write, when he heard a deep, guttural whisper behind him. "You'll never be them." When he turned, a glass from the bar flew off the shelf and shattered on the floor. That was enough. They packed up that same night and fled to a hotel. As of July 2025, the house remains officially under ownership of Madsen's estate. However, word of the haunting has already spread locally. Some residents report seeing a shadowy figure pacing on the balcony late at night, cigar glow faintly visible in the dark. The house sits locked and empty, but neighbors say that even now, the lights sometimes flicker on by themselves, and the smell of whiskey and cigar smoke drifts faintly on the breeze. The house sat exposed on the bluff like an aging, stubborn monument, its stucco walls sun-bleached and cracked, the once vibrant red roof tiles dulled by decades of salt air. Below, the Pacific churned and slapped violently against jagged rocks, a sound that never truly ceased, day or night. Some nights, when the tide was high, the waves seemed to roar louder than usual, as if the ocean itself was trying to drown out the whispers that clung to the house. After Daniel and Marissa fled to a hotel, the house was locked up, but only half-heartedly. The real estate agent in charge of the property, a terse woman named Valerie, still made weekly visits, checking on the place, though she never stayed longer than necessary. She claimed, both to herself and her colleagues, that she didn't believe in any of the rumors. Yet each time she stepped through the arched wooden door, she felt an unexplainable pressure in her chest, like the house itself resented her presence. Inside, the air was always heavier than it should have been, thick, almost oily, carrying the faint but constant scent of old tobacco and spilled whiskey. Dust hung visibly in the light shafts that pierced the half-shuttered windows, yet no amount of cleaning ever seemed to thin it out. In the late afternoon, when the sun angled just right, The walls appeared almost bruised, the creamy paint stained with shadows that looked like handprints, like someone had pressed their palms there in frustration or grief. The den, the infamous room where Daniel had heard the voice, remained the coldest, most still part of the house. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, but it hadn't been lit in years. The hearth was crumbling, ashes from a long-forgotten fire still clinging to the corners. On the adjacent wall stood the built-in bar, a warped mahogany relic stocked with dusty bottles and glasses speckled with grime. Above the bar hung a tarnished mirror, and that mirror, Valerie noted each time she passed, seemed to catch movements that didn't exist, flashes of shadow just out of sync with her own reflection. And then there was the balcony. The glass doors leading to the balcony stuck often, as though the house itself resisted them being opened. But if you stood just behind the doors on a still night, you could sometimes hear the distinct creak of the boards outside, like heavy footsteps pacing from one end to the other. Valerie once stood there, breath held, listening to the wind batter the house. Over the shrill whistle of the sea breeze, she heard it, the thunk of boot heels, slow and measured, as if someone were lost in thought or trapped in memory. In the guest bedroom, where Marissa had slept alone the few nights before they left, the closet door never stayed shut. Valerie would close it, tug it tight, and yet each return visit, she'd find it cracked open, barely a sliver, but enough to reveal the black void within. She once tried to wedge a chair against it, but the next visit, the chair had toppled and the door was again ajar. Then came the smell. Not just smoke or alcohol, this was different. An acrid, burnt smell, like something singed, charred but not fully consumed. It filled the hallway leading to the master bedroom, and Valerie found herself instinctively holding her breath when passing through. The scent triggered something old and buried in her mind, a childhood memory of her grandfather's garage, where he'd burnt leather for repairs. The odor of scorched hide seared into her senses. One afternoon, she brought along a handyman, a quiet man named Arturo, who was tasked with minor repairs before the estate would list the house officially. He was a stocky, no-nonsense type who claimed not to believe in ghosts. But within an hour of working in the house, he asked Valerie if someone else was there. "I keep hearing someone walking around upstairs," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "But there's no one up there." Valerie assured him no one was inside. Yet she herself had begun to feel it, a pulsing awareness, like the air itself was holding its breath, watching. Arturo stayed only 2 hours. He packed up early, refusing to return. "Place ain't right," he said simply. "Feels like someone's just standing in the corner, waitin'." That night, Valerie stayed behind, determined to finish her inspection. The house was still, the sky outside stained with deep purples and reds as the sun drowned in the ocean's mouth. She stood in the living room, eyes tracing the walls, the empty chairs, the lifeless fireplace. As the last light disappeared, she thought she heard it, a voice, rough and low, barely audible, like a man muttering to himself. "Same shit, every night." She spun around, but saw nothing. And yet, when she looked toward the bar mirror, she could swear there was someone sitting in the corner chair, broad-shouldered, hunched, head low as if in thought. She left the house before darkness fully claimed it, locking the doors with trembling hands. But as she walked away, she didn't dare look back, because she was certain that if she did, she'd see someone standing on the balcony, watching her go. Kate turned from the balcony, her breath lodged somewhere between her lungs and throat, the wine in her glass forgotten, the surface trembling faintly with each pulse in her hand. The grooves in the wood stretched in long, erratic lines, some deeper than others, as if a heavy chair or some piece of metal had been dragged repeatedly across the deck, except they had moved no furniture out there. And neither of them had been on the balcony until now. She stared longer than she should have, listening, straining for some hint of movement, but the only sound was the distant churn of the waves crashing into the cliffs far below, their rhythm indifferent, eternal. When Richard found her minutes later, she was still standing at the threshold, staring down. "What are you looking at?" he asked. She shook her head, not wanting to explain. Not just yet. She knew how he'd respond, how he'd reason it out, laugh it away. Inside, the house felt aware. Every door had a subtle resistance, as though it only tolerated being opened. The floors creaked in places that seemed inconsistent with the house's age-fresh creaks, with a weight and pacing that felt too purposeful to be structural settling. The air held on to coldness even on days when the sun burned high over the sea, particularly in the hallway leading to the den. It was in that hallway that Kate first caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye, something broad and heavy, disappearing around the far end near the study room. She turned fast, catching nothing but shadow, yet her skin prickled, an involuntary shudder tightening her shoulders. She told herself it was just light. The house was full of strange angles, thick beams, and imperfect plaster walls that played tricks when the sun dipped. Still, when she ventured toward the den the next morning, she paused at the threshold, heart tightening. The room was colder, not just cool, but a damp chill that touched bone. The bar was intact, its surfaces dulled with neglect, but the mirror above it drew her gaze. She couldn't resist. She stepped inside, the wooden floor beneath her bare feet stiff with cold. She moved to the mirror slowly, watching her reflection grow larger, sharper. For a moment it was just her, and then for a fraction, so brief she questioned her own senses, she thought she saw a man sitting in the chair by the corner. He wasn't looking at her. He stared straight ahead, his posture slouched, elbows resting on his knees like a man weary of his own existence. When she blinked, the chair was empty. Kate backed out of the room without thinking, her breathing shallow. She didn't tell Richard. She didn't want his explanations. She didn't want them to strip away what she had felt because it was real. She was sure. But she wasn't the only one. Richard, too, began to sense the edges of something, not in the form of apparitions, but in presence. He'd be in the study, browsing old books left behind by previous owners, when the scent would come to him: leather, stale smoke, and a faint bitterness like cheap bourbon. It would drift past his nose in a sudden wave, then disappear, replaced by the neutral air of the sea. One evening, alone while Kate was out visiting a neighbor, he poured himself a drink and sat in the living room. The night was quiet, the house dimly lit. He thought he heard the low murmur of a man's voice, not a whisper, but a hushed conversation, one side only, as though someone rehearsed lines to themselves, muttering just beneath the range of understanding. He paused his drink, listening. The voice carried from the hallway, but when he stood and stepped forward, it cut off immediately, replaced by nothing but the dull groan of the wind outside. In the silence that followed, Richard heard another sound, subtle but deliberate, the shifting weight of footsteps on the upper floor, pacing slow, heel to toe, as though someone was thinking. He waited. It continued, steady, unfazed by his attention. So he climbed the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. At the landing, the pacing stopped. He reached the master bedroom. Empty. The guest rooms also empty. But the air, it was wrong. Still, yes, but charged like the minutes before a violent argument. When no one has spoken but the air itself hums with the certainty that words will come, and they will cut. That night, he didn't mention it to Kate. But she watched the way he sat quieter, his eyes distracted, his glass of whiskey barely touched. The house watched them both. Outside, the sea went on thrashing the cliffs below, an endless heartbeat of water against stone, and the moon often hung so low it cast shadows along the balcony railings. On some nights, neighbors later claimed, you could look up at the house from the road below and see a solitary figure standing on the balcony, unmoving, as if surveying the ocean, tall, heavy-shouldered, a glow barely visible near his face, like the faint ember of a cigar burning against the night. But no one was supposed to be on the balcony. And yet, by morning, the grooves in the wooden planks seemed deeper. The house never gave them peace. Each day, its presence deepened, not with loud displays, but with a steady, encroaching oppression, like invisible hands gently pressing on their backs, their chests, their minds. The kind of pressure that made sleep thin and dreams violent. Kate became quieter, her movements slower. She no longer crossed into the den. She avoided the bar entirely, even during the day when the light was bright and unthreatening. Still, even in other rooms, she could feel the den behind her, as if the house had a center of gravity, and that center was him. She didn't need to see him anymore. She knew where he was. sitting, waiting in that corner chair, as though the day never changed for him, as though his clock had stopped, and with it, his capacity for rest. She began painting again, trying to soothe herself with the rhythm of the brush, but her hands betrayed her. She'd intended to paint the sea. The view from the balcony was something she used to love, a reason they had bought the house at all. But what appeared on her canvas was not water, it was a room, dark and cramped, with walls that bled into shadow. And there was always a man, hunched, unrecognizable, head low, surrounded by glass bottles and heavy air. She painted him over and over again, her hands trembling each time she tried to do something else. She told herself she'd stop, but she couldn't, and she never showed the paintings to Richard. Richard, for his part, began sleeping downstairs, claiming his back hurt too much to climb the stairs at night. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't bear the sound of boots on wood anymore, that slow, deliberate pacing in the master bedroom above their heads. Every time he lay there, he'd stare at the ceiling, following the footsteps moving from corner to corner. Sometimes the pacing stopped right above his bed. And then he would hear breathing, not his own, heavy, strained, like a man burdened by a sorrow he couldn't name. One night, unable to sleep, Richard poured himself another drink, the third or fourth of the night. He'd lost count and wandered into the den despite himself. The cold hit him first like stepping into a freezer, a sudden bite in the air that his body recoiled from. He ignored it. The bar stood untouched, though a layer of dust had settled on the wood. Still, the mirror was clear. Too clear. Richard approached it slowly, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have. He stared at himself. Then his eyes shifted, not by choice, but as if drawn to the corner chair reflected behind him. A man was sitting there. It wasn't just a shadow or a shape. It was a man, tall, slumped forward, his thick hands clasped together, staring at the floor between his boots. His face was obscured by shadows, but the mass of his shoulders, the worn denim jacket, the wild hair, Richard knew who he was looking at. Michael Madsen. And then the figure moved. Slowly, the man raised his head, but the shadows clung to his face. Richard's breath caught. The air was thick, sour with the stench of whiskey and sweat. Madsen's eyes, hollow, rimmed with a darkness deeper than shadow, met his in the reflection. And then the voice came, rough and cracked. "You're still here." The sound wasn't just in his ears. It was in his bones, in his teeth, vibrating low like the growl of something alive and hostile. Richard couldn't move. His legs refused to obey. The figure in the mirror stood up, slow and deliberate, towering even more than before. "Get out." The mirror fogged over slightly as if the breath from that command had reached it, and then the glass cracked, a spiderweb fracture blooming right where Richard's reflection stood. He stumbled back, heart racing, crashing into the bookshelf behind him. A few old, heavy books tumbled to the floor with dull thuds. He didn't look back. He ran. Through the hall, up the stairs, shouting for Kate. But she wasn't in bed. She wasn't in the guest rooms. He found her on the balcony, standing in the dark, her canvas at her feet, her hair stirring in the cold wind. She turned to him slowly. Her eyes looked empty, her expression slack, as though she'd been standing there for hours. "He's here," she whispered. "He doesn't want us here." Richard didn't argue. He pulled her inside, her limbs light and fragile in his hands, and they fled the house that night. No bags, no clothes, just the keys and the car, the headlights slicing through the night as they left the house behind them, shrinking in the rearview mirror. The house sits vacant now. The sea still slams against the cliffs below. The wind still whispers through the balcony beams. Neighbors don't see anyone, not truly, but sometimes. When the night is clear and the moon is bright, there's a silhouette visible from the road. A man, alone, standing on the balcony, unmoving. And sometimes, faintly, they hear his voice carried on the ocean wind. "You're still here." But no one ever answers him. The house remains untouched, its stucco walls weathering further under the salt air, the paint peeling like brittle skin. The garden, once a tangle of wild roses and creeping vines, has surrendered to weeds and dry grass, giving the entire property the appearance of a place abandoned for decades, not months. Yet those who pass by, joggers, tourists, delivery drivers, often slow as they approach. There's a heaviness that lingers in the air, a weight that seems to press down on the road itself, as if the house's shadow stretches beyond its walls. Some say that when the wind hits just right, the sound of a man's boots pacing wooden floors can be heard, rhythmic and unyielding, like a prisoner counting steps in a cell of his own making. Others claim that if you stand at the end of the driveway just after dusk, you'll see a faint glow flicker on the balcony, a small orange ember, hanging in the dark, like the lit end of a cigar slowly burning down. The Regans never returned. Their belongings still sit inside, covered in white sheets and dust. Their lives paused and preserved like an unwanted memory. Valerie Moran, the realtor, refuses to list the house again. When asked, she only shakes her head and mutters that some properties aren't meant to have new owners, that some places are already spoken for. And deep within the den, where the mirror remains cracked, a chair still sits in the corner, faint impressions on the seat as though someone rises from it at night, stretches his legs, and begins pacing the floors again, waiting for voices that never come, for visitors who never stay. Because the house belongs to him now, and he's still there, waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.